Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking something that is absolutely universal, yet deeply misunderstood: human desire. Now, forget cultural norms or personal opinions for a second. We're looking purely at the foundational operating system of the human body. We're going to explore the root code that literally drives humanity forward, and honestly, the science behind it is nothing short of fascinating.
Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever stopped to notice that nobody has to sit you down and teach you how to feel attraction? I mean, nobody takes a masterclass on how to experience desire, right? It is a completely self-taught, instinctual skill. You just inherently know how to do it. But why is that? Why is this incredibly powerful impulse pre-installed in every single one of us from the exact moment we are born? Well, the answer lies in the fundamental nature of life itself.
To truly understand this, we kind of have to strip away all the societal taboos. As a biological survival mechanism, desire isn't a character flaw, and it's certainly not a moral failing. It's actually a highly sophisticated, deeply embedded survival software running quietly in the background of your brain. Its primary function? Driving the continuation of your genes. It's an absolutely essential piece of evolutionary engineering that ensures we, actually stick around as a species.
Let's break this down by looking at the specific components, starting with our fundamental biology, the hardware, which is our gene instructions.
From a purely biological standpoint, the ultimate mission of all life is the successful continuation of genes. I want you to think back across our vast evolutionary history. The ancestors who lacked desire or completely ignored sexual signals, well, they simply faded from the gene pool. On the flip side, those who were highly sensitive to those signals, they successfully reproduced. Natural selection heavily favored the motivated. We are literally the descendants of the most driven individuals, essentially biologically swiping right since the dawn of humanity.
And this brilliantly illustrates why we find certain physical traits so irresistible. Your brain acts like a high-tech scanner. Clear skin, bodily symmetry, an ideal waist-to-hip ratio, your subconscious instantly translates these exact physical markers into proof of a powerful immune system and peak reproductive capability. You might think you're just appreciating beauty, but your biology is actually verifying genetic fitness.
All right, so that's the hardware and the genetic imperative. Now let's pop the hood and look at the processor, the dopamine reward. Meet the ventral tegmental area, or let's just call it the VTA for short. This is the brain's VIP reward center. When your eyes detect an attractive target, someone who fits those evolutionary health markers we were just talking about, the VTA immediately fires up. It acts as the chemical engine of desire, flooding your body with massive amounts of dopamine. This creates that sudden rush of excitement, intense pleasure, and anticipation. Basically, your brain is chemically rewarding you for identifying a good genetic match.
Now, what's really interesting here is the biological equivalence. The exact same dopamine reward loop that fires when you spot an attractive person is the one that activates when you eat an incredibly delicious calorie-dense burger or, say, when you win a gold medal. Your brain uses the exact same feel-good currency for attraction as it does for basic everyday survival. It is a brilliant trick of biology, inducing a profound sense of pleasure to guarantee that you repeat behaviors that are highly beneficial for the continuation of the species.
So we have the hardware and the processor. Now for how we interact with the world. The UI/UX, our visual first instinct.
Our biological user interface is built for staggering processing speeds. Long before your conscious, rational mind can deliberate on the details of a face, sometimes in as little as 13 milliseconds, your ancient limbic system has already taken action. The limbic system is fast, emotional, and pure instinct. By the time you consciously realize you're attracted to someone, your biology has already made the decision for you. No slow deliberation, just an instant reaction.
And this rapid-fire neuroscience completely validates what humanity has known for millennia. There's an ancient proverb that states, "The love of beauty is common to all." People have always recognized this universal reaction because it completely bypasses our slower logic centers. It's an instant, unfiltered reaction, and it's universally understood because it universally applies to all of us.
But we aren't just reacting to basic stimuli. What happens when this survival code runs in a highly complex society? That brings us to the output, our instinct for aesthetics. Let's move to and see how this builds across human culture. Because our biological craving for physical beauty doesn't just stop at physical attraction. The exact same neurological circuits that drive us to find a mate also drive us to create breathtaking art, to curate modern interior design, and to appreciate beautiful clothing.
Our profound desire to be surrounded by a beautiful environment is simply an advanced, highly sophisticated expression of that raw biological drive. It's literally instinct elevated to inspiration.
As we wrap up our analysis in this explainer, let's look at how this entire biological operating system comes together. Compiling the code, the grand finale.
So the crucial point is that this whole phenomenon boils down to a precise, endlessly repeating loop in our brains. Step 1, detect the target visually. Step 2, grant the reward by flooding the system with dopamine. And Step 3, drive behavior to establish a connection. This 3-step survival program is running constantly, effectively managing one of our most powerful human experiences.
Now, importantly, we absolutely must recognize a vital balance here. Yes, we possess immense, ancient biological instincts, but we also live within modern, rational, and legal frameworks. Desire itself is inherently neutral. It's just biology doing its job. When this incredibly powerful drive is acknowledged for what it is and carefully guided by human reason while operating within the safe boundaries of the law, it is absolutely not a flaw. It is a brilliant, vital mechanism.
Which leaves us with a remarkable final thought. If we reframe our perspective and recognize this drive not as something to hide, but as the very machinery of life itself, everything changes. As long as we engage our rationality and respect our social frameworks, isn't our deepest, most primal desire actually our absolute greatest proof of human vitality? Think about that the next time you feel a sudden spark of attraction. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep marveling at the incredible engineering of your own biology.